Hi everybody, my name's Jess, I'm a recovered drug addict.
Hello, Jess.
Yeah, I wasn't sure what topic to pick when Faye said you can share about, a certain area of how you apply these principles in your life. And I kind of got to having this philosophical debate with myself around actually step 12, where it says, and to practice these principles in all our affairs. And I was with some fellows and I said, what do you think the principles are? And it was really interesting to note that not all of us could actually agree on what the principles were. And we kind of got into debate about it, and I was like, you know what, that's really interesting. I think I might talk about that. And I think in recovery in general, we all have a general awareness of what spiritual principles are, right? And it's we sort of know we should be honest and we want to be kind and loving. And I was like, but I think it's interesting to actually look at what it says. It says to practice these principles in all our affairs. And it says that at the end of the 12 steps, right? So for me, these principles is clearly telling us are what is to be found in the steps. And it's so I thought, I think I'm going to look through and dig out what are each of the principles that it's telling us about in each of these steps. And hopefully, if I have time, talk about the practical application of those in my own life, or quite often the times when I don't practice them in my own life, because I think it's important to say that it's as it tells us in the book, none of us maintains anything like a perfect adherence to these principles. We strive for progress, not perfection. So, I think it's really nice to touch on the parts where we fail as much as the parts where we succeed. And I think for me, the definition of living a spiritual life is looking at the parts where I fail and being aware of that and trying to make continuous conscious improvement in those areas. So that's just kind of a caveat. But so I was doing a bit of research over this, and I don't want to bring too much outside literature into this, but there is kind of in general AA discourse, some sort of accepted principles that they apply to each step, and I think we don't need to, I think we can take them with a pinch of salt, but some of them are pretty interesting and do quite clearly relate back to the steps. In number one, we admitted we were powerless over drugs and alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. On the AA literature I read, it was kind of defining this as honesty. I think I take more of an acceptance from this, which there's an honesty in acceptance, right? And it's for me, this was really a process of looking at my life and kind of trying to see past the bullshit that I had been feeding myself for such a long time about all the ways that I wasn't an addict and all these things that I was doing to kind of convince myself that I was okay, and actually taking a look at myself and accepting truly what I was. That was a part of it, but I think the second and more important part for me, because I sort of knew that I had a problem. I think anyone that comes into these rooms, we've probably got a bit of awareness that we've got a problem. How else do you realistically end up here? But for me, the acceptance was, yes, that I'm an addict, as it defines me in the book, that, first and foremost, I can't control how much I take when I do take drugs or take alcohol into my system. And also then, I can't control, I've lost the power of choice when I pick up, essentially. That's the mind element. And so there's an acceptance over that. But I think the main acceptance that I got from step one was the acceptance that there's nothing I can do about it. And there's no measure that I can put in place that is going to stop me from taking drugs or picking up a drink or whatever it is. There's actually nothing I can do. And I think that acceptance is really hard for us as human beings. I think in this world, we're kind of conditioned to think that we can solve any problem that's put in front of us. There's a real narrative of you can do this, just try harder and you can do this. And for me, this acceptance principle was no, I can't actually. No, I can't. I need something outside of myself, because I myself I'm fucked. I'm defective in some way when it comes to my thinking around alcohol and drugs. So that's acceptance. And you know what? I have to continue to practice that acceptance every day. Like, yes, I think there's like a sort of step one moment when that sunk from my head sort of thing to my heart. And I really felt it. And it wasn't just an academic, like intellectual exercise. But I still have to practice that. Like, there are days when I sometimes think, I've been around a little while now. I could probably just leave recovery. Probably just not bother having to sort of do all this stuff, you know. I don't have to come to Oxford on the weekend, and I could probably just go. And then I have to re-accept. I'm like, no, you know, like, I have to accept what I am. But sometimes my brain likes to give me another little narrative of like, no, actually, I think I'm not that anymore. No, I am still that. And, you know, there's obviously a broader sense of acceptance that has like really helped me in terms of like my spiritual life of just, yeah, cool, I accept that I'm powerless over alcohol and drugs. But also it kind of follows that if I'm powerless over alcohol and drugs and there's this kind of higher power in my life that, you know, is this infinite and loving presence, I'm actually, I need to accept that I'm powerless over a lot of other stuff as well. Like, I'm powerless over what people think of me. I'm powerless over like manipulating men into liking me, or, you know, all these things that come up in my life. And I just think this is one of the key principles for me, is like this acceptance of what I am. But also acceptance of what other people are and how they treat me. And, you know, like, not saying that I would put up with shit and get walked all over, but just acceptance. Like, you know, this comes into play in my life a lot. Like, I just went on holiday with my family, and let me tell you, if you want to test your spiritual principles, go on holiday with your family, especially when your family are like, you know, we could not be more different in our sort of like approach to life and our political views and all of this stuff, our upbringing, and, you know, we're really opposite. And, you know, I accept them because I don't try and change them, and as a result of that, I have a better time on the holiday. I would still say I had a pretty annoying time, but I was able to accept them, and as a result, I have less tension in my life, right? So there's less resentment, there's less, you know, it makes things easier for me. So I think that's a big one for me, is this idea of acceptance in step one. And then I think, you know, there are a few other ones that it goes through, which I do think are important to touch on, but I'm not going to go into like as much. You know, like it links step two to sort of like a hope. I would personally, and a faith. I think there's like a hope and a faith that come through in your steps 2 and your 3. And, you know, they're also pretty pertinent in my life today, because I have to, you know, in order to give my will over to this higher power, I need to believe that this higher power sort of wants the best for me. Because if I don't believe that, then I'm not really going to be able to give my will over to this power, you know, which I call God. And I think practicing faith can be really difficult in sort of daily life, like in regards to fear. This is where it comes up a lot for me, because I've heard this saying a lot, you know, like faith is kind of like the opposite of fear. And there are a lot of times that I've noticed in my recovery when I cling on to things out of fear, and I lie out of fear, right? Because I'm like scared of what someone might think of me, or I'm scared of losing someone. And that's when like defects like dishonesty start to come up. And it's like, the more times that let's take dishonesty as an example, the times when I've actually, like one that's come up for me a lot recently, and I was talking about to the fellow, was like, I never used to do this at the beginning of my recovery. I started lying to people, like my friends, when I didn't want to like do stuff with them. I started like pretending that I had something else to do, right? I didn't used to do that at the beginning of my recovery. In the beginning of my recovery, I was pretty good at saying like, I'm not feeling up to it tonight, guys. I'd quite like a night on my own, or, you know. And it was like, I wasn't really scared, but as I've gone along, I just think these things start to creep back in, and it's like, what am I scared of? Like, I'm scared sometimes of showing my true self, like my flaws to people, saying I actually feel a bit depressed today. I don't fancy coming out. So I make up a lie, which I feel is like more socially acceptable. So I'm busy with work, you know? And it's like, the more I practice not doing that, the more my faith grows. Because the times when I have said to my friends, and I have been honest and said, guys, I'm actually feeling really anxious today, and I don't want to be around lots of people, my friends have been so loving and caring to me, and they've responded to me, and it's allowed us to build a more authentic connection. And that's grown my faith, because when I follow what I think my higher power would want for me in these situations, my faith grows. And so the more I can practice that, the more I can have, I guess, courage to continue doing that in the future. And in that way, my faith, really gets expanded. And I get courage to practice more of step 3 in my life, of turning my will over and knowing that it's going to turn out, not always how I expected, but normally it's going to turn out okay. And so I think, they're really useful ones, like that faith, especially when it comes down to fighting fear. And then in my step 4, there's fearless. There's this fearlessness. There's like a courage that comes through there. And I think that's one that I could definitely probably be a bit better at. And again, I do think that's linked back to faith. And I think the more that you practice and you sort of try doing that and try doing actions that are fearless and, and require a bit of courage, and things turn out okay, the more that builds faith, and the more I get, I'm able to do that more. And that's an area of my life that I think I could probably stand to improve on a little bit. But and then it goes on in 5 to talk about integrity. And I have to say, I didn't really get integrity from 5, but actually I think there is something in kind of being completely honest with someone else about who you are, and them just treating you neutrally as you do that, and still accepting you and still continuing to have you in their life. And also just finding that people don't react in the way that you think they're going to react. You think that's you're going to read your step 5 to someone, and they're going to be like, oh my fucking god, you're fucked up. You're actually fucking fucked up. But, actually they're like, I relate. And you're like, oh. And that allows you to live as with more integrity, and to be able to be honest about who you are with people, and to be honest about where you've been. And, I also think there's something in integrity that I don't particularly link it to step 5, but as a spiritual principle about being who you say you are, and living in a way that matches up to the way that you say you're going to live. And I think there's a lot, that's what we're looking at today, essentially, right? And it's that's kind of a foundation of everything for me. It's well, am I acting in a way that matches up with what I believe? What I believe is a spiritual life, and am I doing that? And I think, again, that's a process of looking at areas that have started to come up, maybe there's an area of dishonesty that starts to come up, and I look at that, and in that way I try to sort of build a life that has integrity. 6 and 7, willingness and humility. I think willingness in a way that I often test my willingness. I often say that a lot of stuff that I do in my program is a test of my willingness, right? And it's I can say I'm up for living this spiritual life, but when someone on a last minute asks me to do a share, and I had planned on a night in watching movies in front of my sofa, am I going to go and do that share, or am I going to say, oh, I can't make it tonight? Mm-hmm. Am I actually willing? And that's one area that I have to say that I've always tried to be up for, doing all of that stuff, and to be willing to practice this program in a practical way, because I think that's something that's really helped me with my recovery. And it's the more actions that I do that feel closer to this program, the better. And I've always felt so much more spiritual and so much more connected when I'm involved in stuff like service, when I'm involved in kind of service sometimes that I really don't want to do. Makes me feel really spiritual when I do that. But that's the thing. And I think willingness is it's not just willing to do things that you want to do. It's willing to do things that you sometimes don't want to do. For in service to others, and I think that's willingness. It's it's willingness sometimes despite what you want for yourself, and and I think I can feel, as I go more through my recovery, I feel that more. I feel a little bit of a tension if I'm like, oh no, I'm not going to do that, and then I sort of feel it's like, oh, you should really do that, like, and you almost don't feel right, like, not doing some of those things. So I think that also comes as like you practice being in recovery in like step 10 and 11 and 12 a bit more. Okay, so now I've got 5 minutes left and I've only made it to step 6. Did think this might happen. But I think some of them do sort of tie into one another. So 7 is humility, which, like, you know, it says here, humbly ask him to remove our shortcomings. And like, oh my God, this is one that, like, do you know what? I got dumped recently by someone that I really wasn't that into. And let me tell you that there is no more humbling experience than being dumped by someone that you think you're way better than. And I was like, okay, all right, well. But it was an exercise in it, because I thought, why do I think I'm better than this person? Like, what made me think that? Like, I need to look at that. And I was like, yeah, Jess, like, your pride has been slashed down today, and that's a good thing. And, you know, it's just like, you know, the more things I do for humility, like, the better for me. Like, and the more things that happen to me like that, where it's like your ego, you get someone comes along with a big needle and just pops a balloon, and you're like, yeah, the better. Like, honestly. And, you know, I was looking at that and I was like, actually, it's not good to feel that way about, like, someone, and to, in my mind, to treat them in that way where I'm like, yeah, I'm better than you. You're, like, lucky to be, like, you know, doing whatever with me. It's not the case. Like, that's an ego story, right? That's, like, a complete, like, fabrication. That's a narrative that I've told myself in order to, like, protect myself. And ultimately, that's not spiritual. So, you know, God just comes along and pops that in. So, you know, the more I can live in that way, I think, and have fewer expectations, the better, and the happier I ultimately am. Okay, 8 is love. I mean, I think this goes without saying that, like, for me, one of, like, the guiding principles in this program has been, like, love and kindness and tolerance of others, and also actually really crucially, like, of myself. And I think, again, that links back to integrity of just like, okay, like, if this God loves me, then I should be able to love myself. And, you know, so I do things for myself that are good for me. And, you know, I don't, you know, and I just think that's, like, such a key foundation for me of this program, because, like, when I treat myself with love and, you know, treat others with love, like, to me, that's, like, the closest I think I've felt to, like, the spiritual life. Like, to me, that's, like, the one biggest guiding principle, I think, because I think all of the other things kind of fall into place if you lead with that one. So I do try, but, you know, tolerance is a difficult one when I drive my car around London, for example. But ultimately, you know, and again, I think it's just seeing that all these things, when I act out and when I'm like, fucking dropping the C-bomb, like, in the car, like, I have a really bad thing where I'll go like this up against the window to people in the car, and I'll be like, I'm only damaging myself. Like, that person doesn't care. Like, I'm actually, and then I'm going on the day and I'm thinking, fuck you, fuck. Like, I'm stressing myself out. You know, it's not good for me. And I think the best thing about this is, like, when you look at all these principles, it's not like a punishment list. It's not like all these things you should do, you should live this way. It's like, when I live by these principles, my life is so much better. Like, I feel so much better. It's not like a tick list of, like, commandments. It's like, if you don't want to live this way, like, okay, like, you know, you see how that feels, because it does not feel good. And so, you know, yeah, we're working on that one. We're working on a bit of tolerance in the car. Okay, yeah, love, like, okay, we're doing pretty well. We've got about 2 minutes left. Yeah, one minute, okay. I've touched on awareness, which is part of step 11. Like, obviously we can, like, increase awareness through our meditation, and awareness of, like, things that God wants to bring to our attention, and just having that quiet time to actually connect and strip back all the bullshit of, like, narratives that go on in my head all the time has been so important for me. And I didn't touch on step 10, which was patience and perseverance, and, like, continuing to do things, I think, in a routine way, and continuing to look at stuff, I think, is important. But, like, yeah, step 12, as it comes down to it, and here is service. And I do think, again, like, that's been one of the key, like, pillars for me of my recovery, and like service in all areas, like yes, in my fellowship or fellowships, but just generally service to others. Like my whole life has transformed since my perspective was changed as a result of doing this program into like not what can I get out of others, but what can I do for others. And I think that was the key thing. And when I live my life through that perspective, spiritually, everything changed for me actually. And that perspective change only came about as working the steps. And, you know, I would certainly not be here, you know, driving to Oxford on a weekend in the pissing rain. But it's my absolute pleasure to do this today, and brings me so much joy, as well as hopefully is useful to other people. And I think, yeah, that's been really, really key for me as well. So anyway, I hope this has been useful. I wanted it to be like a kind of introduction into what everyone else was going to say. So yeah, thank you for having me, and so lovely to see you all.
Thank you.